Welcome. My name is Don Davis. I'm the editor-at-large at Digital Commerce 360. I'll be moderating today's webinar. I've been really looking forward to this webinar because it takes up some really challenging questions. The origin really came several months ago when HCL and Perficient came to us and said, they saw that a lot of B2B companies are struggling with artificial intelligence and machine learning, and they wanted to know why. And we agreed to do a survey and a report and a webinar, and we're going to be reporting today on the results of that survey, and we're going to hear from experts from HCL and Proficient about how their views of how companies can succeed with AI in B2B e-commerce. Our speakers will be Lauren Friedman, who has been an e-commerce consultant pretty much since there was e-commerce. Her title today is Senior Consumer Insights Analyst at Digital Commerce 360. She'll be joined by Paul Pasecco, who's the go-to-market leader for customer experience, data platforms, and AI at HCL. And Mike Rabior, who's principal and chief strategist for commerce at the digital consultancy Perficient. Just a few housekeeping notes before we get going. We'll take questions at the end, but you can ask them at any time using the chat box on the right side of your screen. You can also use that box to let us know if there are any technical difficulties, and we'll help you out with that. All of our attendees today will be eligible for today's raffle for one of 3 Amazon gift cards and a copy of Digital Commerce 360 2022 B2B Commerce Market Report, $399 value. And we'll be announcing the winners of today's raffle at the end of the webinar. So another good reason to stick around. But most important reason is because there's going to be a lot of interesting questions and answers about AI and B2B e-commerce. So let's get started with Lauren Friedman from Digital Commerce 360. Go ahead, Lauren.
Hi, Don, and welcome to everybody. And I hope everyone's having a good day so far. I'm excited to be here. Also found the topic very interesting. I'm going to be sharing with you today the highlights from our Digital Commerce 360 survey. The survey was based on 62 respondents. You can see that 24 of the sellers were doing over 100 million, while 38 were doing under 100 million dollars. It was conducted in the February-March early part of this year. So just to look at some of the firmographics really quickly, I've already kind of touched on annual online sales, but from a B2B sales standpoint, just under half, 48% were doing 10 million or less, 29% 10 to 100 million, 12% 100 million to a billion, and 11% over $1 billion. And when we look at that, what percentage of the web as a percentage of B2B sales, it's kind of a 1/3, 1/3, 1/3. 37% were doing less than 10%, 29% 11 to 49%, and 34% 50% or more. But all in all, I really want to share that so you understand that we have a really nice cross-section of sellers, which I thought brought some really interesting data into the mix. So one last thing before we move on to some of the survey findings. We wanted to understand what vertical that best describes their market. And you can see we've got everything from consumer products to computers and electronics, industrial equipment, food and beverage, hardware and home furnishings, automotive, and even aviation. So we've got you covered when it comes to the verticals that, sellers are involved in. So our first area of focus is going to be digital maturity and AI/ML technologies. And what you find here is our question that we started with was, which of the following best describes your company's digital maturity? And here we broke it out into 4 different groups. The first one was experts. So think of it as they're the digital transformation leader or guru. They fully understand their customers. Their channels are all consistent, and they're always out there exceeding expectations. The advanced is right behind them. The channels are well developed, and their services are offered consistently across those channels. So they do have that omni-channel experience, but they're just not as strong. They're not yet winning the marathon there. And what you can see is that 54% of those sellers who were over $100 million identified themselves in that area, but 45% of those under $100 million, so fairly strong. From an intermediate perspective, they're listening to the needs of the customer, but their channels aren't all aligned. You've got 42% of those greater than 100 million identifying themselves that way versus 29% of the smaller. And lastly, of course, the beginner, not surprisingly, very few of the larger companies identify there, 4%, but 26% of the smaller are in the beginner category. So there's people kind of in all areas, in all levels of knowledge and expertise in that area. And I think that really will bring some interesting dynamics into the research for you. So of course, from there, we wanted to understand what is your timeline for employing or enhancing your use of AI ML. And what we see here is that 67% of the larger folks are currently employing it versus 24%, even though that in some instances, 42% say they're doing it effectively, but only 25% are meeting the expectations that they would like to see. 25% of the larger companies have future plans versus 50% who intend to launch it either this year or next. And of course, 8% of the larger companies have no plans left at all or don't intend to do that or already would be in the mix versus 26% of the smaller. So larger sellers are employing it significantly more, though the good news is smaller companies also have plans in the works. So where does it rank as a priority? Because we always know with technology, the goal is to get it higher on the priority list. So here, what we find is that 51% of the larger companies give it the highest priority versus 34% of the smaller. From a current priority, but using an independent software vendor or cloud service provider, you see that 37% of the larger companies are doing so versus 16% of the smaller. And then we have a group of varying priorities, which I think are the catch-all. So smaller companies, no 22 traction in this area versus 4% of the larger. 18% of those smaller companies find it interesting, but they don't have any resources. And 14% of those companies, it's just not a priority, and it's just probably not going to make the cut for a little bit. So at the end of the day, larger sellers rank it as a higher priority, and they tend to have those internal teams. And you'll hear a lot more about the people aspect as we move forward. So we asked, what business functions have you or are you planning to add to an AI ML learning capability? People could select all that apply. And I thought it was interesting here that, of course, an array of features are in place. They're on the horizon, and ML can really address a lot of those. So I thought back to, my early days in e-commerce, and of course, product recommendations was always first on the list from this algorithm perspective. 53% said they're using or feeling that they're going to be adding that feature. There's a range of them that come out into the search area. 47% keyword search. You see even product categorization at 29% toward the bottom. You also see visual product search at 26%. Impressive given that that hasn't been in the mix for as long. And natural language search at 19%. But you also see the notion of price optimization at 47%. Customer segmentation really addressing the marketing side of things at 40%. And my passion, the conversion, UI optimization, also coming in at that important 40% level. Chatbots even at 34%, anomaly detections at 31%, fraud at the same. So the ability for AI and ML to address these, I think, is very, very powerful. But of course, like every other technology I've ever encountered, we wanted to understand the obstacles, and there's always obstacles. So what obstacles do you face when trying to optimize your AI ML initiatives? It always comes down to the people. I've never seen a technology where that hasn't been the first thing. So 42% cited an inexperienced team. It harkened me back to the time when you couldn't find anyone who would understand how to use analytics. 27% said accessing the right information to implement recommendations. So, again, we have this great information, this great data, but how do we turn this around, deliver the results? And I think speaking to the need to support the people, the need for multiple tools to use it effectively at 26%. And then we have some organizational elements. The 26% who cite conflicting internal goals, can't even imagine that would ever happen in the seller environment. And the ability to integrate with other parts of the business, 24%. So the obstacles faced in optimizing AI ML start with the lack of experience, access to the right information, effective tools, and the strategic issues, really the internal organizational issues that inhibit that performance. So there's still a lot of work to be done to get this functioning in a way to optimize it. So speaking of the organization that I've just touched upon and some of the opportunities, let's look at that. So who within your organization and any third parties are involved in these initiatives? You can see that it's a joint effort, especially involving business intelligence, and to me, corporate analytics are kind of going together in many instances, 52% and 47% respectively. And then to see marketing so strong at 47%, playing to that customer segmentation and how to really, attract the right customer and market to them effectively. Customer experience, I'm glad to see at 27%. Search 23%, and that same number using an analytics consultant, maybe it's a smaller organization. Customer insights, 19%. So we have a lot of parties typically involved in this investment and initiative. And when we look at this from a large, small perspective, I thought it was interesting as well, so I wanted to share that. Larger sellers involve a broader range of constituents, including corporate analytics. So if you look at that, you see larger 67% versus the 34%. And you think about business intelligence, 71% of the larger, only 39% of the smaller organizations. In marketing, a little bit less of a gap at 58% to 39%. And then we kind of move on from there. So of course, not surprisingly, larger sellers have a broader range of constituents driving these initiatives. So how about business value and benefits? What were the sellers looking for? So this I thought was really stood out to me. What business value do you expect to get from AI/ML? And we asked sellers to rank this 1 to 5, where 1 is the highest priority and 5 is the lowest. So this is the top 2. And you can see that the size of the company has little impact on the business value that's expected. You look at revenue growth, which nobody doesn't want to have that. 58% gave that a top 2 versus 53% of the smaller. And of course, the whole notion of cost reduction, 42 versus 39, and the same for a more engaging customer experience. You see a little bit lower on the product and the service quality, and then improvements to inventory availability or supply chain. I was surprised to see that and would have expected that to be higher given sort of the state of the supply chain. But interesting to see that no matter your size, you've got similar goals and you have similar expectations in terms of the business value that you want to see. From a business perspective, what benefits are you looking to gain from an AI/ML learning-driven solution? And what you find here is the same, to me, always comes to the same elements. Driving more conversion, which means making more money, 55% of the people. But interesting to see that 55%, the exact same percentage, talk about cost efficiencies moving beyond the manual processes. So again, they want both. They don't want one or the other. They want to have both aspects. And of course, personalization was always the promise of this. So 48% citing those more personalized experiences, and 45% optimizing the sales process, such as through merchandising based on inventory levels. A couple other ones that I'd touch on, which were interesting to me, were turning insights into action, which talks about one of the early things I talked about was how do you take this information and this powerful data and do something more with it, 44%, and just learning more about the customer, 40%. So you can see these recurring themes taking place throughout. So companies expect a robust set of benefits from these solutions, starting with higher conversion and cost efficiencies. So how did it look when you took a look at that from a large, small perspective? There's some big differences here. Larger sellers are looking for more cost efficiencies, aren't they always? In that 79 versus 39, a 40% gap. Turning insights into action at 58 versus 34, and almost a similar one, more personalized, but a little bit closer together at 58 to 42. Conversions, that comes up a slightly higher, which is interesting on the smaller perspective, 58 to 50. And so many of the others, I think, seem to be relatively close together. So what you find in the end is that larger sellers are looking for more cost efficiencies, actionable strategies, and personalized experiences. So I want to wrap up with one of the questions that we had integrated into the survey. And I always like to do these because I find some of these qualitative questions really deliver a lot of interesting answers. So we asked the sellers to please share your agreement with the following statements. And this was a top 2 out of 5, basically vary and somewhat agree. 2 in 3 sellers believe that AI ML can be a differentiator, and it's required for growth. It's almost like it's non-negotiable, though of course challenges remain, as they always do. So 82%, you can differentiate your business among competitors. Successful B2B sellers will need AI for growth, 76%. It's not like I'm maybe going to put this in the mix. I'm going to have this. Having transparency, including algorithms, is important to AI optimization. 2 out of the 3 people at 66%. Despite great data, we struggle to get insights and value during decision making. Again, 66%. They acknowledge it's going to be difficult to do, 65% of the people, but they believe it's going to pay off. And I think that's what's most important. And 31% said they're even willing to share aggregated data, even with competitors, to get better results. So I think it's just, at the end of the day, when I look at this, 2 out of 3 believe that this is a differentiator. This is going to be, really, I think, make a stand for these sellers and make it different, and also make it better for their customers. So I really found this something interesting to participate. And with that, I'm going to turn things back to Don Davis, who is going to bring on our panel.
Thanks, Lauren. Yeah, it was really striking how many people who responded to the survey really do think the AI eventually will be a game changer. But as you see, there's a big range in terms of success so far, but also goals, investment levels, and priorities. Now let's talk about what's going on in the real world. So I'm going to invite Paul Pasecco from HCL Software and Mike Rabior from Perficient to turn on their cameras and join me for a conversation about AI and B2B e-commerce. So Paul and Mike, what struck you from looking at this survey?
Well, first of all, Don, thanks for having me, and thanks for the report. It was interesting to go through. One of the things that was most striking to me is only 66% of respondents came and said transparency in AI and ML was important to them, because I think one of the things that I hear an awful lot, especially when it comes to commerce, is people who are willing to go into AI are not joining it up to a new business. There's an appreciable amount of revenue and time and effort put into the current commerce environment within the organization. So there's an awful lot of fear and trepidation to just hand over a certain response or decision making to artificial intelligence. So when they do run, the first concern or challenge or opportunity people see is to really understand why the AI is making a recommendation or choosing a path or promoting a certain answer over another. So yeah, if you were to ask me to fill this out on behalf of others, I would see 95 to 100% of respondents saying, no, I need to understand why the AI is doing what it is, because that's one of the most important pieces of insight I can gain. So that really stood out to me, especially on that last slide there. I know, Paul, I'll give you some forethought.
I definitely agree with that, Mike, especially with more advanced analytic models. When companies are trying to blend maybe their offline traditional modeling with their demographics, psychographics with online behaviors, that's definitely a theme that comes up with the data science team or the analytics team. But Don, to go back to your question about sort of what are we saying, what struck me was, the separation between most companies, a majority of companies have AI as a goal, but there's not enough people to sort of follow through on it, or there isn't the skill set. And that's both we're seeing that both internally and with the external partners, and how that translates to my organization as a software company is customers are asking for, they're falling into that mode that a lot of us are familiar with, where they're looking for the silver bullet feature or the silver bullet product, because they don't have the skill sets to do the system integration or to stitch things together. And that's always a little shaky, right? Because these systems are complex and they always require some level of system integration. And when they're trying to put too much pressure to have a silver bullet, and I think, Mike, it feeds into the problem that you raised as well, is that people don't trust it as well. So that was Don, that was the thing that struck me the most out of out of the survey results.
Yeah, and particularly I noticed that, larger companies, the question of integration was more top of mind, which makes sense because they probably have more systems, more business units, and so forth. But I just want to get back to Mike's point about sort of the AI being a black box, and like why is it telling me to do this? I mean, are these AI systems really designed to say not only do this, but here's why I think you should do this? I honestly don't know. Are they good at explaining why, what their reason is?
Some are purposely built to do so. The answering why they've made decisions, and that's part of understanding that you need to curate AI. I mean, whether or not AI is informing you of the decisions it's making, or it's just demonstrating the decisions, you need to help the machine learn. It's kind of like bringing an intern into your business. It knows nothing about your business until you start training it. And so you need to understand that whether or not it's going to report out to you why it's making recommendations or not, or how the AI machine has been built and the kind of interface you have to it, you need to understand that you are a curator of its content and decision making. And so it is iterative. And the more the machines are built, the algorithms are built, the UI is built to demonstrate the kinds of decision making, what was boosted and buried in terms of relevancy, for you to interpret and help it learn if it got it wrong. And there are feedback loops that I think people misconstrue, that the chatbot or whatever piece of AI or ML you're going to run is just going to automatically learn about good or bad results and automatically tweak the system, and you're not going to have any visibility into it whatsoever. So you've essentially released, in the case of search rankings or product recommendations, you just handed that over to the machine and hope it's more effective than you were. And that's not the case. And I think that's one of the biggest misnomers out there, is that you simply release it to an algorithm and hope it outbeats your bestseller.
I think there's a big gap in the industry, and part of it's technology, but the other part is I don't think software companies have an understanding about how AI or analytics has been used traditionally, especially for large brands. Most large brands have internal data science teams or partners. A lot of times it's their ad agencies, and they've been producing predictive, have they been segmenting their consumer populations, customer populations, and doing prediction for years. These models are updated typically quarterly, and these entire organizations run off of these models that run sort of outside of the marketing automation platforms, and organizations are run off of those. But the marketing automation platforms, a lot of those now have AI built in that's really focused on the digital behaviors. And ideally, what our customers want to do is they want to be able to merge all of this deep historical sort of legacy scores and results from the AI happening outside of the platforms in with the behavioral platforms to improve the messaging and the personalization. The problem is there's a lot of software companies that, as you mentioned, considered on the software side their AI algorithms as black box, so you don't get the results. And culturally, the AI teams at the brands or their agencies, they're held accountable for performance, and so they want to know what algorithms are being used on the software side, and it creates this gap. What ends up happening is a lot of times the technology AI isn't used because the data scientists can't explain it. And so I think as an industry, the tools companies have to accommodate reading in the scores that happen from the modeling outside of the platform, and then to be able to extend those models with enough information that the analysts are able to understand and explain and trust the results.
Yeah, and if you can even look at that last piece of data on the previous slide, regardless of size of organization, no one wants to share their data. And I think that's another striking piece of information, that no one wants to hand their information off to a black box in some third party's cloud and participate in some kind of hive mind that they don't own. And it's really striking to me, the more I think about it, that regardless of the maturity or size of the organization, data is now viewed as a competitive advantage. That's great for the industry. That's great for AI, because it seems to say regardless of where you are in the spectrum, data is now valuable. And that probably 5 years ago, that probably wasn't as transparent or as apparent as it is today to the entire industry.
So I just want to move on to my next question. We sort of already started talking about it, but my question is based on your experience with talking to clients. Why are B2B companies struggling with AI, and what sort of advice can you give them to overcome the obstacles that they're facing?
Well, like we talked about, I think there's a skills gap there on getting started, right? So even though the C-suite can dictate they want to move forward with AI, there needs to be people to activate. And sort of a couple of thoughts there on where the challenge is. Yes, there's not enough people, both internally and within partners. But I think also there's AI, ML is one of those terms that has different meanings for different people, and so it spans everything from dashboarding and reporting, business intelligence, all the way into deep learning. And when you're talking with operational folks, it's more of a process. So I think getting the same sort of lexicon down is really important. So that's sort of thought one. Thought two is, I think, like a lot of things, people think and they have to boil the ocean. Where I think we have a really good example. If you want to consider in the industry where there was some success, is chatbots were sort of the first generation thing that I think a lot of especially B2B companies found successful. They got value out of it. It was a very clear business case because it could reduce the cost of a service center, right? So I think that's a perfect example where the ocean wasn't boiled, a very finite, tight use case can be put together. And I think the same thing can be done. Like, I think if customers focus on very simplistically, increasing order size by 2%, what do we need to do to increase order size? And that simple use case will drive in just the right amount of customer segmentation and personalization that needs to happen, just the data that you need to make that happen, and just what part of the marketing operation that needs to be updated without having to do a full data map of everything. And that'll feed itself to create an ROI to move on to the next use case. So I think long-winded way of saying is 2 or 3 really tight use cases, I think, can get an organization down the path, and also not having to be expert on everything as well.
Yeah, before I move on to Mike, Paul, what exactly do you mean by deep learning?
So that would be prediction, right? Prediction on what's best. And typically that requires, some say a year, but it's really 2, 3 or more years worth of data in all of the channels. And that requires, to go down that path, you need to have all of your channel data identified, assembled, connected, cleansed, which can take months to do for a really large organization, especially when you think about the number of corporate actions or acquisitions or sales. When you try to go back 2, 3, 4 years to get data, there's people cleaning up data before they even started a company. It sometimes becomes really, really difficult. And again, the more variables that you end up with to create the prediction on, the next best buy, it means that the experience of your team that are building out those models, kind of goes up exponentially to find the underperforming pockets inside of a large database like that, and then to activate. And I'll bring up this other topic too, because and I know it's a little off topic, but what goes hand in hand is as soon as you come up with the results, you then have to figure out how are you going to action that. So again, another thing that I work with my customers on is, look, only segment your population to the number of segments that you can afford to activate. Meaning B2B has a huge problem with content. They just don't have enough content in general. And most of the customers I work with certainly don't have enough content to personalize based on 8, 10 segments of customers. So one of the recommendations when I work with my customers is keep the population, your number of segments that you want to focus on to get, for instance, that 2 to 3% increase in sales. Keep it down to 2, 3, 4, customer segments, and make sure you have the content that is going to be able to personalize to enact the action you want, so that you can activate inside of your marketing operation.
Good advice. Mike, well, what's your experience of why companies are struggling?
I agree with Paul. I think cleanliness of data has plagued the B2B industry for many years. I mean, B2C's also better, but having the right data and having the insight as to what data is missing, pulling up synthetic data to fill gaps, these are real challenges in the organization to get started. But even beyond that, I think it really comes down to, and Paul mentioned this as well, understanding what AI means. And AI is, I guess the best analogy is it's a tool chest. And what you can do with that tool chest is really not well understood. I mean, there are classic examples and people understand the use cases of chatbot like Paul described. But if you actually look at what AI, the possibilities of AI, it goes much beyond the traditional analytic view in a lot of B2B organizations where I have a lot of data. I want to churn on that data and spit out reports, or, hey, wouldn't it be great if I could automate something out of that report? That's only one piece of artificial intelligence. The ability for you to consume and interpret pictures, photographs, is another avenue to enhance experience that people aren't really aware of, because they don't understand that when Google and Amazon you're uploading your images to the cloud, they're analyzing, churning on that, figuring out well beyond what the facial recognition of it is, but what product is behind you. They probably know what flower is behind me if I send it to the cloud. That's great information to leverage. In fact, we have a client a traditional manufacturer in the fashion industry, needed to, especially during COVID, demonstrate to its end customer that they could help them find the right size. And they used artificial intelligence for that. They created an app around that artificial intelligence that could take a two-dimensional image, convert it based on AI-driven formulas to figure out what you actually look like and your proportions are in 3 dimensions, and then model a garment based on that 3D image model that was generated. It was incredibly useful to them because fit is a very important thing to the consumer in that industry, and that's a propensity to buy. That gets you over that last mile to make the confident purchase that you need. So really understanding, I think, in the B2B set, just what the tool chest of AI has at its disposal and what problems you can then solve with it is 1 or 2 steps removed in many people's minds.
I think a lot of companies are just trying to figure out how to get started. So, I mean, how would you advise a company to figure out, like, what's the low-hanging fruit for me that I could do and get a quick win? And also, what are some of the more complicated things that maybe AI would be really good at, but like nobody's doing?
I guess take the one on sort of the low-hanging fruit. I think a common theme, large companies, small companies, on the B2B side, they're all trying to move their sellers into consultative selling, get them out of the business of sort of being involved in order taking. And what a lot of our customers are moving towards self-service portals, right? Self-service portals with personalization that can do suggestive selling, especially customers that have a complicated bill of material where they're, it's not a straight order. It's maybe having to assemble 2 or 3 or 4 different subcomponents to make an order. It's been complicated by the supply chain, right? With the requiring substitutions of subcomponents. So the biggest thing we see is, so customers are trying to get their sellers, consultative selling, get them out of the weeds of the orders, which means making smarter, customer order portals. So push the ordering back to the customers. But doing that, there's now an obligation to monitor if your customers are putting together the order now online, is being able to monitor when they're struggling, right? And being able to get that intelligence to the sales rep so they can make strategic calls into that buyer and help them with the sale if they're having trouble, whether it is a substitution or it's just too complex for them. so that the sales aren't dragging. So that's it on the sort of the high end. In terms of what you can get going with, sort of mentioned it, is, you know, focus on what you know you can do, 3-4 customer segments, and start small and have just enough content. It's amazing when you go from no personalization when you're reaching out through channels to just doing the simplest things. You get incredible lift, right? So start small. You don't have to go against the whole customer population. Start with 3 or 4 segments and just have 2 or 3 variant messages for each of those 3 or 4 populations, and you're going to see a lift. And you can even do that having it sort of semi-automated, right? You don't have to have it fully automated, just to get into the rhythm of what's working and not. And that will give you the learning on what needs to be automated, so you can expand the amount of offers that you want to load up into an automated platform and get the rules set up.
Yeah, every IT executive and marketer will tell you that they're budget constrained. Starting small is usually now. I think the industry is at a point now where if you are just getting into AI, there are a lot of outright AI in the cloud opportunities for you to start engaging with, or even the tools that you've purchased. You know, the different pieces of software, whether it be marketing recommendations, search, inventory management systems, they're all pulling in pieces of AI into their suite. A good way to dip your toe in that water without being totally blown away with your budget is to start leveraging some of those and be curious. Understand that you're going down a bit of a knowledge gathering journey, and understanding what AI can do for you and why it's doing what it's doing is going to enlighten you, and you can see the uplift. You can prove it to yourself and your stakeholders that this is a worthwhile investment. You know, you don't have to go, nor should you, or will you be able to in this market, build your own data team from scratch with 10 staff of data scientists who are ready to go, and you won't be able to leverage them appropriately in day one anyway. So it is an evolution, much like e-commerce has been over the last 20 years. If you look at an e-commerce website from 2005, you'd laugh it off Internet Explorer 6. But we're in a different place now because we've spent the time to get there. AI is a knowledge journey. It's not a piece of software you buy and say, now I'm an AI company. You need to level yourself up, and there are ways to get started that don't break the bank or your willingness to try.
Yeah, so in our conversation, we saw it in the survey, there's resistance in many organizations to AI, sometimes from internal folks, sometimes from external agencies and consultants. How do you address those issues and remove those obstacles?
So sort of covered that a little bit. It's definitely an issue when the software companies have black box their AI, and there's modeling or prediction or AI happening outside of the core platform. So I think the solve for that is making sure that the software tool has the ability to merge legacy scores in and gives enough visibility into the algorithms that are being used, that the data scientists or analysts are able to be comfortable to explain what's going on and for them to trust.
It's trust and confidence. I mean, these are most B2B companies are not new startups. They've been doing business for a long time. And they do it in a very particular way. That goes beyond AI. It's just a more risk-averse organization, because in many cases there's either legacy processes been working just fine for the last 25, 30 years, or there's so much at stake. These are big numbers in larger organizations we're talking about. No executive wants to jeopardize a significant portion of that revenue stream. So there's a confidence building that things are not going to be as disastrous as people's more conservative nature in these businesses might suggest. So I think tearing down the barriers of that is finding, like Paul said, starting small somehow, and that can take many different forms. But the biggest thing to do, in my mind, is to find what in your organization is already a pain point that AI can address. Don't try and improve something. try and solve a problem, try and overcome an existing challenge. People are much more receptive to leveraging AI when there's a known problem that AI can address than trying to say, I'm going to outpace something that someone believes is already working well.
Yeah.
And that's probably the biggest advice I would give anyone who's looking down that. Find something that AI can champion a solution to, not try and better something through AI.
And it just occurred to me what I forgot is, so Don, one of the other issues that comes up when customers have what they can consider proprietary knowledge for their models that they don't want shared in a common area. Tactically speaking, I think those type of companies, and this happens, we actually have this conversation a lot in the EU with their privacy issues and regulations, is I think it's important that the environment that you're setting up, the architecture, you're able to separate or obfuscate the modeling logic from the results scores that drive the operation and the actions. So I think it's important that you know, if that's an issue for customers, that they look for platforms that allows you to have a hybrid cloud infrastructure so that you can have your models on-prem or in a virtual private cloud and just share out the results into the rest of the automation platform that you're communicating with consumers with.
Yeah, that brings me to actually my next question, which really came out of talking to a rather large seller, distributor of goods to the U.S. federal government, who's done quite a bit of AI with an internal team, including on price optimization, a very big deal in government contracts. And he said, you know, if we come up with a good idea, I don't want to share it with my competitors, you know, because then everybody will be able, you know, to do it just as well as I can. I think I get an advantage from that. So, you know, on the other hand, you know, you need you know, a team that's capable of doing that. That's hard to find these days. So, you know, how do you know when is the, you know, the time to go it alone and do what this distributor is doing, or when is it okay to you know, use some commercial software, knowing that your results are going to be available to potentially your competitors?
Yeah, that's a tough question. I mean, you know, today's I guess differentiator or competitive advantage is maybe, you know, next year's best practice. You know, I think in that example I just gave, if a customer, you know, if there's truly something unique and proprietary that a customer has in terms of their models, I would say, you know, you'd have to probably look at the cost of having to separate your analytics from the rest of the infrastructure and that systems integration cost and maintenance cost compared to what truly you think that differentiation is in terms of sales or the impact on the business, and then weigh out that cost benefit. You know, knowing of course that the industry is always advancing, right? So, and meaning your competitors are probably going to have the capability, you know, within the next next year or so.
It's an interesting challenge to answer, to be honest, when you talk about it, because you have understanding what is truly proprietary data that's meaningful to your business is a very digitally mature organizational challenge. Because, like it or not, if you use Google Analytics, you're already sharing to the hive mind. If you already have one of these cloud providers as a third party, you're already contributing. I think some business leaders would probably be pretty scared if I turned on a list of the number of cookies that are being deployed on the main page of their .com site. And they need to be aware that they've contributed for years on this. So they have handed over their customer behavior to these cloud providers simply by leveraging, you know, things as simple as the share this logo that people used to use to get Facebook and Twitter and all the social media plug-in links for little effort. You've been providing this data probably unknowingly, because no one reads the fine print, for years. And that's, if you have a software as a service provider in your organization, they're leveraging your data already to some degree. You may not be handing it over as a database record, but you're certainly handing over an appreciable amount of it through indirect means. So you have to understand that. You have to know that. And then, but I think the deeper, more meaningful information you have is something that AI can reach into for you, and you have to protect. And that's when you get to that level of maturity where you're saying, look, I can contribute some to the hive mind out there, but the pieces of data that are really valuable and insightful that are meaningful to my business as differentiation is something you then divide and make sure you protect from that. And that's something you take as an internal effort to leverage, because when you get to that level of maturation as an organization, you get to that point where you can see those pieces of data driving real differentiation for you as a business. But you're certainly not going to start there in your industry. By the time you get there, you are probably a thought leader in your industry in terms of digital maturity.
Okay, we just have a couple more minutes because I do want to get two questions from the audience. But two quick questions. One is, talent. How do you find people who can help you implement AI? Any quick thoughts on that?
Yeah, so I guess to start, this has always been a problem for the 2 or 3 decades I've been in the industry. This has been a huge issue. I know when I was running, digital operations in New York on the market on an agency side, we would constantly lose our analysts to the financial firms that were only half a dozen blocks away. Interestingly, the last 2 years with the lockdowns that we've had, has presented an opportunity. I could think of 2 or 3 customers that have taken this as an opportunity to hire. There, a lot of our country's best B2B companies are in the middle of the country, right? And a lot of the skill set is on the coasts. But there's 2 or 3 customers I'm thinking of that have gone out and hired remotely data scientists that are on the coast, but they're working full time for B2B companies that are in the Midwest. So I find that really encouraging. I also think it fits, sort of with the work-life balance with the millennials and Gen Zs that are coming up. So that's the first thing in terms of trying to find people. And then, of course, keeping them is also an issue. And I think just a best practice that I've seen is not to, when you hire your data analyst, have a shared team. So don't just have the marketing team hire, their analysts just onto their team, and then you have logistics and the supply chain folks that have their own modelers, or try to have one shared team and rotate, especially for the younger hires, right? They haven't specialized yet, and they want to get a taste of running analytics and building models for different parts of the organization. So create sort of a professional discipline. And I think you're going to not only be able to attract the talent in, you're going to be able to keep them for a little bit longer as well.
Yeah, I think the biggest thing is make it an interesting problem to solve. When there's choice out there, and this goes beyond just data scientists, but probably the broader IT spectrum, and people want interesting work, and they have a plethora of options to them. So the more commitment you show them to the role they play and how significant it will be and how impactful it will be, and the commitment the business has behind it, the more interested those candidates become. Because there is a large number out there of opportunities that are really just join my data science team. But the business and the recruiters aren't doing, in my opinion, a good enough job in some cases telling them the value proposition that this person brings to the organization. Make them feel like you're committed to this and they play a key part of it. If you can do that, you actually do differentiate yourself pretty significantly from the masses who are trying to hire into these spaces today.
Okay, good advice. Well, let's move on to take some questions from the audience. We only have 6 or 7 minutes left, and then I want to leave time to announce our winners. So one question, this came through from the survey: AI, machine learning may make sense for big companies, but are smaller companies going to get as much bang for the buck? So, does AI really make sense for smaller companies?
So I think so. Get that example where we're seeing customers that, regardless of the size of the company, they want their sellers to be consultative selling, right? They want them out of the regular transactions, so that they're making sales development calls and partner calls with their customers. I think in those cases, just very simply, the value that you can add to a seller picking up the phone and calling their customer, just letting them know simple sentiment scores on how many times they've called into the service center and what the sentiment of that call was, is incredibly important. For all the reasons we know. And then also what the most recent behaviors were online, right? So if a customer has had a struggle event, right, trying to configure something on the portal, and they've called into the service center, and that service rep has codified that call as being a hot call, then that's incredibly important for the rep to know, right? And maybe in a small company that the seller is going to know that with the service agent, but not necessarily what's going on online. So I think it is really important for even the small companies. And lastly too, sorry to hop in again. We started seeing this with B2C a number of years ago, is millennials and even late bloomers, their buying behaviors are fundamentally different than boomers. Millennials want to do the research up front. They don't want to talk to a human being until what was traditionally the end of the sales cycle, closer to the end of the sales cycle. So there needs to be way more content. There needs to be more ability to engage the millennial buyers now much earlier, and that requires the ability to be monitoring those behaviors online and translating them so that sellers can plop their calls in at strategic times, so they're not chasing away or turning off their millennial buyers. So regardless of company size, that's a common theme that's needed across the industry for B2B.
It's a great question. I think the best way to answer it is a smaller organization is going to have different challenges and different opportunities with AI than a large organization. Large organizations with a terabyte of data and 3 years of history to mine is going to have a different opportunity with AI than someone who doesn't. Smaller companies can look more to automation and enrichment of features and capabilities through AI that would traditionally take manpower away. Insight is another good one. Smaller companies may not have the mass amount of data to churn on, but they certainly have, even without $500 million or more in revenue, they still have a lot of behavioral information that you can gain insight from, even from just web session logs. Smaller companies sometimes serve a very discrete customer base, and other times they don't even know how to segment properly. Leveraging AI to find patterns that aren't obvious to you in your customer's buying journey, so you can target or segment better, is a very good first step in that journey. And AI can play a really significant part in making recommendations that you don't have to staff for. You don't need 4 or 5 marketers sitting there every day trying to build a marketing campaign. You can leverage AI to do it for you, and over time get better at it than probably you're aware of. Especially if you're a small business who has a really broad catalog of offerings. A good example would be something like a electronic parts distributor. How you cross-section 500,000 SKUs to find the hidden values of what to recommend or what to go across, because I have a transistor over here fits over there, and I have this use case or this problem this build I'm trying to move towards. That's an incredibly complicated environment to live in as a small business to really effectively know that. And AI creates really compelling use cases to quickly mine the kind of behavioral insight you can get simply by having 6 months of data that show how humans are actually bouncing around your catalog on an e-commerce site.
We just got about 1 more minute, but I've got a good question. What are a couple of key questions you would ask a vendor who's promoting an AI product?
I think regardless if it's a pure play vendor, AI vendor, or it's AI features within a larger platform, I think there's probably 2 areas I would really investigate. The first is the integration point, right? So how are the scores being shared out, and can it, and have them demonstrate and explain to you how the scores can be used both slowly changing or in real time, so that, I think as an industry, we're at the point where we're moving into, personalizing messages in session. So that needs to be very clear on, and there's usually two different modes to do that. So ask a lot of questions around around the interface points. And then secondly, and we sort of hit upon this, is a lot of questions around how you load variables into that model, and how transparent it is, and how extendable it is. Meaning, you might start off with loading 4 variables this quarter, but this time next year you might have 8 or 10 variables you're loading, and you need to operationally know how difficult that is, and if you have to bring down parts of the architecture to do that, which you want to, that would not be the goal, right? You want to know that those models can be updated without destabilizing the rest of your enterprise marketing, in this case, your enterprise marketing infrastructure. So how dynamic it is for the analysts to be able to update those models, and then how the amount of visibility on what's happening once the models are calling the algorithms for the personalization.
Yeah, I would go back to the survey. I think people are going to ask about the transparency and am I sharing my data are the first 2 top of mind questions. What am I going to learn from using your tool, and am I giving my competitors my competitive advantage as part of this process? The only final bit of advice I'd say is who can help me leverage your product? Not a shameless plug as a digital consultancy for Perficient, but buying it and then trying to just adopt it on your own, that's a long process. So if you have accelerators that can get me to value faster, you should be a lot more interesting to me than competitors who don't.
Okay, well, we're just about out of time. I want to thank Paul Pasecco from HCL Software, Mike Rabior from Perficient, and Lauren Friedman from Digital Commerce 360, and of course, everybody for attending. We do have 3 winners for the gift cards: Sonia Bush, Doug Tompkin, and Lance Owide. And even if I mispronounce your name, you still get the card. So apologies in advance. There will be a replay of this webinar made available, and after we conclude, you'll see a pop-up window on your screen asking for your feedback on today's webinar. We appreciate it if you fill it out, help us make our webinars better. And also keep an eye out for our weekly emails about upcoming webinars from Digital Commerce 360, or you can go to digitalcommerce360.com to see our schedule or view archived webinars like this one. So thank you all. Very interesting discussion. A lot more to say about it, but I hope this was useful, and have a great day.